In the previous video, we talked about graphene, sites, groups, pages, and all the different ways that we can define statically defined content within that hierarchy. But in this video, we're going to talk about microapplications and microapplication instantiations as they're defined within a group. So if you remember from the previous video, we noticed that microapplications are defined completely outside of groups, right? So all of the code, all of the resources, and all the endpoints and everything, those are actually defined all outside of the groups themselves. But if we actually want to be able to use these applications and do something more than just develop them, we need to create app instances within the groups themselves. So let's take a look at that. So we've got app instances within the groups, and then if we want to be able to define groups or rather app instances on a particular page within a group, we can do that as well, but only after we've defined the app instance in a particular group. And this is all important to manage permissions and make sure that people can't have access to things that they really shouldn't have access to. So let's take a look at what that looks like within a vanilla instantiation of Graphene. So here we are within a Graphene application that was just set up. We've got our default group. We've got a welcome page within our default group, and we've got a basic content widget on our welcome page. And that's really it. So I'm going to hop into the admin panel, and let's take a look at microapplications. You'll notice that there are no microapplications defined, and if we look within our default group, you'll notice that there are no app instances defined either. So let's create a new microapplication. So I'm going to create a new microapplication. I'm just going to call it Hello World because this is going to be our really basic, simple introduction to microapplications. And I'm going to define myself as the lead developer here. All right, so now we're inside of our microapplication. We've got a number of tabs across the top here in terms of resources. So these are the external APIs or external data sources that we might actually want to pull from or push to at a later date once we've done a little bit more with our application. This is our interaction with any really the outside world. Scripts. This is where we put all of our JavaScript code for any interactivity on the client-side application. We've got our templates here. This is where we put all of our HTML, our markup code, and then any additional. We use a syntax called mustache for templating and iterating through templates. We have our styles here, which is our CSS, and we have forms, which include our user options and our administrative options, as well as any additional forms that we might want to define. But for the sake of this demo, we're just going to do a template, and we're just going to type something very simple in here. So let's just start with something very simple called Hello World. And I'll put an exclamation point right there. So this is really, really basic, the most simple kind of application that we could define, and it's just called Hello World. And I'm going to go ahead and save this, but what I'm also going to do, and I think I mentioned this previously, microapplications have a reasonably robust versioning system built into them. So I saved it, and it's currently running as the working version, but what I'm also going to do is I'm also going to publish this, which is going to create an actual new version. And if you were comparing this to something like GitHub, or rather Git, this is really just kind of what it would look like if you were versioning the code or checking the code in as a particular version. So let's just call this initial version with Hello World and save that right there. Okay, so we've just created our application. It's been published. If we look up here on the right-hand side, it says initial version with Hello World, so there's our code. But if we go back to our test page here, you'll notice that we don't see the application anywhere. And the reason for that is that we haven't actually instantiated our application yet, so we need to go ahead and do that. So let's go back to our groups. Let's go back to our default group. Let's go to our app instances, and let's create this new instantiation of the Hello World microapplication. So we'll call that Hello World App Instance, INSTANCE, and slug will be Hello World. And we have an option here to make it so that the app instance is not listed in the menu. I'm actually going to go ahead and leave that unchecked, but that might be something that you would want to do if you want to hide the app instance, or if you actually wanted to add the app instance to a page and you didn't necessarily want it to be visible in the menu, only on that particular page. But for the sake of this demo, I'm going to leave that unchecked. So we'll press save here. And here it is. Here's our app instance, and it's currently bound directly to that initial version, right? So this app instance, even if we were to go back and make changes to the micro application and save those changes, this app instance will only ever run the code from that initial version. So any changes that are made, with additional development aren't going to impact this app instance as everything is set up right now. So let's go ahead and visit that app instance. And here we are. So we had our welcome page over here, right? This was our basic page. And then next to it, we have this app instance. And this is our Hello World app instance. And what we've got here is Hello World, right? Just the text that we had typed in here. Nothing really complicated, but it's all pretty much working. But that's not particularly interesting, right? I mean, like that's pretty much all you would get if right over here we had, static code on a page. Having static code, statically defined code is not particularly interesting. It really only gets interesting if you start pulling data from external data sources or you have more interactivity. So let's go ahead and try to do that. Let's go back into our admin panel here. Let's pull up our micro application, and let's rather than just having this hello world text be defined here statically, let's see if we can pull some data from some external data source. And this is where you might have like an external third-party RESTful API, or even just a JSON data feed, which has, is updated periodically. So over here in my Git repository, I have this dummy JSON feed, which just has some statically defined JSON. But for the sake of this demo, let's pretend as though this was a database or some dynamically generated object. So what I've got here is I've got my URL to my JSON feed, and I've got some cats. This is just an array of images of cats. There's our cats. And I've also got a message here that says hello world. So let's go ahead and copy this. And let's go into our resources and add a new resource. Now, resource is where we define these external third-party APIs or these external endpoints. So let's create a new one, and I'm going to call this Git Data because it's from my Git repo, right? I'm going to put the path in here, and I'm going to check this box here that says fetch. And the reason I'm going to do that is that's telling the micro application engine that whenever you run this micro application as an app instance, go fetch that data from that third-party source. We could tell it to cache the data if we wanted to, but we're not going to do that here. We could also, do things where we'd convert the data from some other data source if we wanted to. So with an XML data, we could actually convert it dynamically to JSON. But because it's already JSON data, we're not going to do anything special there. So let's press save. And in our template, instead of saying hello world, we'll leave the hello world here. But in addition to that, let's put something else. Let's reference this message that we had here. And so the way we're going to do that is we're just going to say we're going to use this mustache syntax, and we're going to reference what we called this thing here, which was get data. So get data dot message, right? Because get data is what we referred to this whole object here as, and message is what the hello world thing is defined as inside of that object. And just to clarify this, I'm going to wrap this inside of a bootstrap class. We'll do alert and alert info, just so that it looks a little bit different than the other one does above it. So I'm going to go ahead and press save, and you'll notice that we're now on our working version here. Okay, so for those of you who have been paying attention, though, you'll notice that, let's see, let's go visit it. So there's a shortcut here. We can actually jump right into the instances. And you'll notice that nothing's changed, right? I mean, even though we updated that code and we changed it and we added those resources and everything, nothing actually happened. And the reason for that is that we didn't actually update the app instance to point to a different version of the code. The app instance itself, and if we were to hop in here, we can look at that. The app instance is still running against the initial version with hello world, right? It's not looking at different code. So if we want to tell the app instance to look at the latest version of the code, we either need to go back to our app and reversion it, which we could do. We could publish a new version, or we can tell our app instance itself, and let's change the version here, to just use the latest version, either working or published. So it doesn't necessarily have to be version. We're just going to use the latest code here. And you'll notice that as soon as I did that, these additional resources showed up. And so here is our external data resource that we have here. So let's save that, and we'll go back to our application, and here we go. So now we've got hello world, which was statically defined from the previous iteration of the code. Not terribly exciting. But then below it, we've got our hello world, which is actually pulling from this external data object over here. And it was able to inject that right into our application. So let's try to do a little bit more here. Let's see if we can get those images of those cats into our API, because so far Hello World is not all that interesting. We haven't really proven anything yet. But let's see if we could actually get all these pictures of these cats into our application here. So let's go back to our application, and I'm going to we're going to reference that get data again, but instead of get data.message, this time we're going to reference get data, the cats here. So it would be get data.cats. Okay, so let's do that. We'll do get data.cats. And let's say we want to just do the first cat here. This is sad cat. And so we'll do get data.cats.0, which would be the first index into that array. So we'll put that here. All right, so let's save that and go back to our application. And well, so what this does is it returns back an object. And the reason is because this right here is an object. We really need to reference either the ID or the name or the URL. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do getData.cats.0, and then we'll actually pull the name, and we'll try to print that out. So getData.cats.0.name. All right, I'm gonna print that out, and it says sad cat. But that's not really all that interesting. We want the name is nice, but we'd really like to have the image of the cat. So let's try to put that in there as well. We'll do this again, and we're gonna do, let's see, I think it was called URL. Yep, it was called URL. So we can print that out as well, and let's see what we have here. Okay, so we're close. We have the URL to the image, and we have the text sad cat. But again, having the URL to the image is not particularly exciting. We really want to embed that image into the page. Well, as I mentioned before, in these templates, we can actually put full HTML in here. So we'll do img src equals, and this is just basic HTML that I'm typing in here. And we'll close the img tag. So that's just a basic image tag, and we're telling it that the source should reference that URL, and then we're going to put the name after it. So let's see what we have now. Excellent. So now we have our sad cat, and it says sad cat next to it. But what if we wanted to print not just the first cat, but we want to iterate through that entire object, or that entire array rather, of cats, and we wanted to print all of them out? Well, we can do that, and that's actually just a basic mustache syntax. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say get data.cats, right? But to tell it that we want to iterate through them, we're going to put this little hashtag in front of that. And so this is kind of doing like a poor man's for each loop within our template. So we're saying go to get data, iterate through all of the cats, and then on every one, run this right here. And then this is kind of the end of the loop. And then over here, instead of saying getData.cats.0.url, all we're going to have to do is just say URL and name, because within the loop, we now have those exposed to us at the highest level. So we'll save that, and we'll press refresh. So now we have sad cat, we have tiny kitten, and wow, that's a big picture. We have the cat on with its belly. So there's all of our cats. So we've got hello world defined statically up at the top. We've got hello world defined as an object coming from our data feed, and then we've got all of our pictures of our cats as an iterative object going through here. And let's actually just clean this up a little bit. I'm going to add some more CSS to this just to make it a little bit easier. So style equals width. We'll make it be 100 pixels just so that the images aren't as big as they really are here. There we go. So now they're a lot smaller. We have little thumbnails of the images themselves. And I added style right in line here. We can do that, but because we've got the style tab over here, we could actually apply global CSS if we wanted to do something like that. So I'll just show that really quick. For those of you who are familiar with HTML, we can put a class on it. We can just call it cat image. So we have our class of cat image, and then over here we're going to say cat image, and we will just say all things with a class of cat image are going to have a width of 100. And so if we save that and we run it again, it pretty much gives you the exact same thing as we had before. So we've got over here, we've got our page. It's got some basic content on it. We have our micro application, and this is actually pulling the data from that external data feed. And that's pretty much it. One more thing that I do want to show, though, is we talked about over here, let's see, in this slide, we had indicated that in addition to instantiating these applications, we can actually add those app instances to the page itself. So let's go ahead and try that out. We're actually going to try to add this whole widget to the welcome page. So we'll go to welcome, we'll click the edit button. We are going to add micro application here. So the only micro app that we have right now is the Hello World app instance. So we'll do Hello World. We'll save that. And we'll put it in a container. That seems good. And we'll press done. And here we are. So now we have that full app micro application and the app instance running inside of a page within the default group on the welcome page. So you can see here that this actually gets pretty powerful pretty quickly in terms of what you can do with micro applications, especially when you can start pulling data from external data sources. The last thing that I'm going to show, and this also gets back to what we talked about previously here in the last slide, is that we have this notion of these endpoints. And the endpoints become really useful, especially when you have encrypted or secure data feeds where they're not necessarily public. Now, for the example that we just did here, that JSON data feed that I had is absolutely public, so there's really no reason to do it with an endpoint. But we're going to go through the process of setting up endpoints as well, just to show what that would look like. So let's jump back over here. And let's dive back into our admin panel. And you'll notice here that we have no endpoints defined currently. So let's define a new endpoint. And we're going to let's call this endpoint, we'll call it get data. That's really the same thing as we had before, but that makes sense. And you'll notice that we can have authentication on here with a username and password. But because this endpoint that we have doesn't really have any authentication, we don't really need that. And so I'm just going to copy this full route here. Here it is. And I'm going to paste it in here. Except I'm not going to include the db.json. I'm going to include the full route, the full URL, but not that last piece. And sometimes this might be useful because if you've got an API, you may want to reuse certain components of it, but there will be appended to the end of the URL string. So this is nearly the full URL, but not quite the entire thing. So we'll save that there. And then if we go back to our micro application, instead of hard coding in this full URL here, all we're going to put in here is this db.json piece. That's it, right? So we're kind of expecting, now this application is expecting that it's going to be pulling from some data feed which has all of the rest of the stuff defined. All it really cares about here is this db.json. But what that does mean, if I save this here and we go back and look at our micro application, let's see, we'll go back and we'll visit this. It doesn't work anymore, right? Because it's trying to go out and fetch data from db.json, and that's not a full URL. So we need to somehow in our app instance, we need to map that endpoint back to our micro application, and that will build the entire URL and map those two things together. So let's go look at our resources here. And so you'll notice that we had it here before as none, and so that's not a fully qualified URL. But if we select get data from here, it concatenates together the endpoint, right, which had that part right there, and it mixes it with the get data route. And when it puts those together, it actually creates a fully qualified URL. And if I go back and look at this application, now it should work just fine again. So like I said, for things that are not, or rather for things that are public routes, this isn't necessarily totally necessary, but it's totally useful if you have things that are encrypted, secure endpoints where you want to have robust security around it, and you don't want to allow just any resource to be able to access that information. So if we go back over here, though, you'll notice within our micro application instance, and as well as embedded here on this page, we now have this fully functioning micro application and micro application instance on our application. So that's really it for this video. Thank you very much.